September 12, 1942. Stalingrad. The ruins of what was once Factory District No. 3. 12-year-old Sasha Filippov crouched in the basement of a collapsed apartment building, listening to the sound of German boots crunching through rubble overhead. Dust filtered down through cracks in the ceiling. His breathing was shallow, measured. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across streets that no longer had names, only numbers assigned by Soviet military cartographers trying to make sense of chaos. The boy had lived in this neighborhood his entire life. He knew every alley, every courtyard, every cellar entrance. Now those streets were a maze of German machine gun nests, Soviet sniper positions, and corpses too dangerous to retrieve. The battle for Stalingrad had transformed the city into something unrecognizable, a landscape where familiar landmarks became deadly tactical features, where the apartment building where his family had celebrated his 10th birthday was now a fortified German position. Sasha's parents were dead. Killed in the first week of September when German artillery obliterated the civilian housing blocks on the western edge of the factory district. His older brother Victor had been conscripted into a workers' battalion, sent to dig anti-tank ditches somewhere north of the city. Sasha hadn't heard from him in 3 weeks. The boy was alone. Across the river, on the eastern bank of the Volga, Soviet commanders studied maps of the factory district with growing frustration. The German 6th Army had pushed deep into Stalingrad's industrial heart, capturing factory after factory, grinding forward through rubble and blood. General Vasily Chukov, commander of the 62nd Army defending the city, needed information. He needed to know German positions, their strength, their ammunition stores, their command posts. He needed scouts. But sending soldiers into the German-controlled sectors meant certain death. Patrols disappeared. Radio operators were hunted down. The Germans had turned the factory district into a killing ground where every street corner held an ambush, where every window concealed a marksman. What Chukov needed was someone the Germans wouldn't suspect. Someone who could move through the ruins without drawing attention. Someone small enough to slip through holes in walls. Someone brave enough or desperate enough to risk everything. What he needed was a child. The Soviet military command in Stalingrad faced an impossible problem in September 1942. The German 6th Army, over 250,000 strong, had pushed into the city with overwhelming force. They controlled the high ground, the western approaches, most of the industrial zones. They had better equipment, better artillery, better tactical positions. But the Germans had one critical weakness. Their intelligence was failing. The urban combat environment made traditional reconnaissance impossible. Aerial photography showed only rubble. Radio intercepts were limited. German patrols sent into Soviet-held areas rarely returned. The battlefield had fractured into a patchwork of isolated strongpoints where forces from both sides occupied different floors of the same building, where combat occurred at distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. The Germans needed to know where Soviet reinforcements were landing across the Volga. They needed to know ammunition depot locations. They needed to know command post positions. They were blind. And so were the Soviets. This mutual blindness created a tactical stalemate. Both sides fought with incomplete information, launching attacks based on guesswork, losing men to positions they hadn't known existed. The battle became a grinding, intimate horror show where victories were measured by capturing single buildings, where a staircase became a front line that shifted floor by floor. Soviet commanders recognized that whoever could break this information blackout would gain a decisive advantage. Several attempts were made to infiltrate German-held areas with trained scouts. All failed. The Germans had established a systematic cordon, checkpoints at every major intersection, patrols sweeping through ruins on regular schedules. No Soviet soldier in uniform could penetrate these defenses. But Stalingrad was still populated with civilians. Thousands had remained in the city despite evacuation orders. They lived in cellars, in sewers, in the rubble of their former homes. They scavenged food from destroyed warehouses. They existed in the spaces between armies trying to survive. The Germans had learned to ignore these civilians. They were refugees, ghosts haunting the ruins. They posed no military threat. They were simply part of the landscape now, survivors waiting for the battle to end. This indifference created an opportunity. On September 8, 1942, Soviet military intelligence officers began recruiting civilian scouts from among the refugees sheltering on the eastern bank of the Volga. They needed people who knew Stalingrad's geography, who could move through the city without arousing German suspicion, who could gather information and return with it across the river. They needed people willing to walk into German-controlled territory with no weapons, no backup, no hope of rescue if discovered. The recruitment process was informal, almost casual. Intelligence officers would approach refugees in the makeshift camps, ask if they knew the western districts, if they had family trapped in German-held areas. Those who answered yes were pulled aside for quiet conversations. The offer was simple: work as a scout, gather information, and in return receive extra rations for themselves and their families. Some accepted. Many refused. Those who agreed understood the risks. Captured scouts would be executed as spies. There would be no prisoner exchange, no negotiation. Death was certain. Among those who volunteered in mid-September was a 12-year-old boy named Sasha Filippov. He had approached the intelligence officers himself. Told them he knew the factory district intimately. Told them he could move through German lines without being noticed. Told them he wanted to help. The officers were skeptical. A child? Too young. Too risky. But the boy was insistent. He described the street layout with precision, named specific buildings, identified German positions he'd observed from his basement hiding place. He demonstrated a detailed knowledge of the battlefield that surprised the intelligence officers. More importantly, he was motivated. His parents were dead. His brother was missing. He had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The combination of local knowledge, small size, and desperate courage made him valuable. After 3 days of evaluation, the Soviet intelligence service accepted Sasha Filippov as a civilian scout. They gave him a code number, taught him basic intelligence gathering techniques, showed him how to estimate troop strength, how to identify different types of artillery, how to memorize information without writing anything down. They did not give him a weapon. A child carrying a weapon would be shot on sight. Unarmed, he might be ignored, might be dismissed as just another refugee scavenging for food. On September 15, 1942, Sasha made his first crossing back into German-held territory. He walked across the ruins of the factory district in daylight, moving slowly, carefully, like a scavenger searching for food. German soldiers watched him pass. None stopped him. He was just a child, harmless, irrelevant. It was the beginning of a reconnaissance operation that would fundamentally alter the course of the battle for Stalingrad. The first crossing changed everything Sasha understood about war and survival. He left the Soviet-held eastern bank before dawn, swimming across the Volga with instructions memorized. No written orders. Nothing that could identify him as a scout if captured. Just a mental checklist. Observe German positions near the Red October factory, count artillery pieces, identify command posts, note ammunition storage locations. The crossing itself terrified him. The Volga was cold in September, the current strong. He'd been a good swimmer before the war, spent summers at the river with his brother. But swimming across an active battlefield was different. German positions on the western bank fired at anything moving on the water. Tracer rounds skipped across the surface. Artillery shells threw up geysers. Sasha made it across by staying low, swimming slowly, letting the current carry him downstream before crawling onto the western shore in a sector the Germans apparently considered unimportant. They'd concentrated their forces further north, around the factory complexes. This stretch of riverbank was largely unwatched. He moved inland through rubble that had been homes, schools, shops. Everything was destroyed. The Stalingrad he'd known was gone. In its place was a wasteland of broken concrete and twisted metal, a city reduced to abstract shapes that offered concealment but no comfort. The Germans had established defensive positions in a pattern Sasha began to recognize as he moved deeper into their territory. They favored corner buildings with clear fields of fire. They placed machine gun nests on second floors where they could cover approaches. They left the ground floors partially collapsed to slow any attacking force. These patterns made them predictable. Sasha learned to avoid the obvious routes, the streets the Germans would naturally watch. He moved through courtyards, through holes blown in building walls, through basement tunnels that connected buildings the Germans didn't realize were linked. His size became an advantage. Adult soldiers couldn't fit through some of the passages he used. On that first mission, he counted 17 German machine gun positions, 4 artillery pieces, and identified what appeared to be a company headquarters in the basement of a reinforced factory building. He memorized locations by referencing landmarks. The machine gun nest was 3 buildings north of the water tower foundation. The headquarters was in the building with the partially collapsed smokestack. The return crossing was easier. He knew the route now. Knew where the Germans weren't watching. He made it back to Soviet lines just after dark, exhausted, shivering from the cold water and the adrenaline crash. The intelligence officers debriefed him for 2 hours. Asked detailed questions about every position, every observation. Cross-referenced his reports with partial aerial reconnaissance photographs. Everything he'd reported was accurate. They sent him back 3 days later. The second crossing revealed something the Soviet commanders desperately needed: German ammunition dumps. Sasha had noticed trucks arriving at a partially destroyed warehouse near the factory district's southern edge. They came at night, unloaded crates under guard, left before dawn. The warehouse itself looked abandoned from the street, but Sasha watched from a collapsed building across the courtyard and saw German soldiers entering and leaving through a hidden entrance in the rubble. He reported the location. Soviet artillery struck the warehouse 2 nights later. The explosion lit up the entire district. Secondary detonations continued for hours as stored ammunition cooked off. German forces in that sector ran critically low on ammunition within days. The success validated the strategy. A 12-year-old boy could accomplish what an entire reconnaissance platoon couldn't. The Germans never suspected him. They'd seen him multiple times, this thin child picking through ruins searching for food or salvage. They dismissed him as irrelevant. Their dismissal was their first crucial mistake. Sasha made 8 crossings in October 1942. Each time he gathered information that Soviet commanders used to plan attacks, position artillery, identify targets. Each time he noticed more details about German defensive patterns, their routines, their weaknesses. He learned that German patrols changed guard every 2 hours at specific checkpoints. That they conducted sweeps through certain streets on a predictable schedule. That they relaxed their vigilance during meal times. That they trusted their defensive positions so completely they'd become complacent about internal security. This knowledge transformed how Soviet forces operated in Stalingrad. Instead of launching blind attacks against unknown positions, they could now plan operations with specific intelligence. They knew which buildings to target, which routes to use, where German strength was concentrated and where it was thin. Sasha wasn't the only civilian scout operating in Stalingrad. Soviet intelligence had recruited dozens of others, men and women who crossed into German territory and returned with information. But Sasha was among the most effective. His youth made him invisible. The Germans simply couldn't conceive of a child as a threat. They would learn better. In late October, during his 9th crossing, Sasha observed German preparations for a major offensive against the Red October factory. He watched as infantry companies assembled in staging areas, as artillery was repositioned, as ammunition stockpiles were moved forward. He counted units, estimated strength, noted timing. The information reached Soviet command 12 hours before the German attack. It gave them time to reinforce defensive positions, pre-position counterattack forces, arrange artillery strikes on German assembly areas. When the German offensive came, it crashed into prepared defenses. Soviet forces knew exactly where the main thrust would come from. They'd mined the approach routes. They'd zeroed their artillery on the staging areas. They'd positioned reserves where they'd be most effective. The German attack failed with heavy casualties. They'd lost the element of surprise. They'd attacked into a prepared defense. All because a 12-year-old boy had watched them prepare and reported what he saw. After that failure, German intelligence officers began investigating how the Soviets had known their plans. They interrogated captured Soviet soldiers. They reviewed their own security procedures. They looked for radio intercepts, for compromised communications, for spies within their own ranks. They never looked at the civilian refugees moving through the ruins. They never considered that the thin boy they'd seen scavenging near their positions might be the source of their intelligence failures. By November, Sasha had developed into something beyond a simple scout. He'd learned to recognize different types of German artillery by sound, to estimate troop strength by counting vehicles and supply deliveries, to identify officer ranks by observing who gave orders and who followed them. The Soviet intelligence officers who debriefed him started asking more sophisticated questions. Not just what did you see, but what patterns did you notice, and what seemed unusual. They were teaching him to think like an intelligence analyst, to see not just individual facts but the larger picture those facts revealed. This education came with risks. The more effective Sasha became, the more missions he ran, the greater the chance of discovery. Statistics were against him. Eventually he would make a mistake, or German security would improve, or simple bad luck would betray him. The intelligence officers knew this. They tried to limit his missions, to send him less frequently. But Sasha insisted on continuing. He'd found purpose in the intelligence work. It gave him agency in a situation where civilians had none. It allowed him to fight back against the force that had destroyed his family and his city. He was 12 years old and he'd become a soldier without ever carrying a weapon. The transformation from refugee child to intelligence asset had consequences that rippled far beyond individual reconnaissance reports. By mid-November 1942, German forces in Stalingrad were experiencing a phenomenon they couldn't explain. Their attacks consistently met prepared resistance. Their assembly areas came under artillery fire before operations began. Their ammunition depots suffered unexpected strikes. Their command posts relocated after Soviet forces demonstrated precise knowledge of their locations. It was as if the Soviets could see through walls, could predict German movements before they happened. Intelligence officers in the 6th Army headquarters studied the pattern, looking for explanations. They suspected radio intercepts at first, but German communication security remained intact. They looked for high-level spies, for compromised staff officers, for infiltrated units. They found nothing. The mystery deepened their paranoia. If Soviet intelligence was this effective, how deep did the penetration go? Which German units were compromised? Who could be trusted? The uncertainty created operational paralysis. German commanders became cautious, second-guessing decisions, delaying attacks while they verified security. This hesitation cost them the initiative. Meanwhile, Sasha's missions continued. His 13th crossing in late November focused on German preparations for Operation Winter Storm, the relief effort intended to break through to the encircled 6th Army. Sasha observed German forces consolidating near the southwestern approaches to the city, noted the arrival of fresh divisions, counted tanks and artillery pieces. The information allowed Soviet command to redeploy forces to counter the relief attempt before it fully developed. They knew where the attack would come from. They knew its approximate strength. They positioned their best anti-tank units where they'd be most effective. When Operation Winter Storm began on December 12, it advanced into a carefully prepared defense. The element of surprise was gone. Soviet forces had used Sasha's intelligence to create a layered defensive system that blunted the German advance. The relief effort failed. The Sixth Army remained trapped. German intelligence officers intensified their investigation into how Soviet forces consistently obtained advance warning of their operations. They implemented new security protocols, restricted movement near frontline positions, interrogated civilians found in combat zones. In early December they executed 3 civilians suspected of spying. None of them were scouts. They were simply refugees in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the execution sent a message. The Germans were now hunting for Soviet intelligence sources among the civilian population. The risk to Sasha and the other scouts increased dramatically. Soviet intelligence officers debated pulling their civilian network out of German territory. The danger was becoming too extreme. The Germans were actively hunting now. But the intelligence stream from Stalingrad was too valuable. Soviet command relied on it for operational planning. Without it they'd be fighting blind again. They decided to continue operations but increase precautions. Scouts would cross less frequently. They'd avoid German checkpoints entirely. They'd limit their time in German-controlled territory. Sasha made his 14th crossing on December 18, 1942. His mission was to confirm German positions near the Barrikady factory, to observe any preparations for evacuation or withdrawal. Soviet command suspected the Germans might attempt a breakout. They needed to know if those suspicions were accurate. The mission went badly from the start. Sasha crossed the Volga in darkness, but the German positions on the western bank had been reinforced. New machine gun nests covered the shoreline. Searchlights swept the water at irregular intervals. He had to swim further downstream than usual, landing in an unfamiliar sector. The neighborhood was different from the areas he knew well. The rubble patterns were unfamiliar. He couldn't use his normal navigation landmarks. Worse, German patrols were more active here, moving through streets on unpredictable schedules. He moved slowly, carefully, trying to orient himself. Found a partially collapsed building that offered concealment and climbed to the second floor to observe German positions. From this vantage point he could see movement near the Barrikady factory, could count vehicles, could estimate force strength. He was gathering information when he heard voices below. German soldiers entering the building. A patrol taking shelter from the cold. Sasha froze. The building had one exit, the stairwell the Germans were now occupying. He was trapped on the second floor with no way down. He moved deeper into the ruins, found a corner where collapsed ceiling provided cover, made himself as small as possible. The German patrol stayed in the building for 2 hours. Sasha listened to them talking, smoking, complaining about the cold. They were directly below him. If any of them decided to explore the upper floors, he'd be discovered. They never came upstairs. When they finally left, Sasha waited another 30 minutes before moving. His hands were shaking. He'd come within meters of capture, of execution. The mission had become too dangerous. He needed to get back across the river. But he still needed to complete his reconnaissance first. He forced himself to move to a better observation point, spent another hour watching German positions, memorizing what he saw. Then he began the journey back to the Volga, moving through unfamiliar streets, avoiding patrol routes he'd observed. He made it to the riverbank just before dawn. The crossing was rough. The temperature had dropped. Ice was forming along the shore. The water was so cold it felt like knives against his skin. Halfway across he almost gave up, almost let the current take him. His muscles were cramping. His lungs burned. He made it to the eastern bank by pure stubbornness. The intelligence officers who debriefed him noted how shaken he was. They pulled him from active missions, told him to rest, told him he'd done enough. He'd completed 14 crossings. He'd provided intelligence that had shaped the entire battle. He'd earned the right to stop. Sasha refused. He wanted to continue. The officers argued with him. Explained that the risks were too extreme now. That the Germans were hunting scouts actively. That his luck couldn't hold forever. That he'd already contributed more than anyone could ask. Sasha told them his brother Victor was still missing. That he wanted to search for him in the German-held areas. That he needed to know what happened to his family. That he couldn't just stop while there were still questions unanswered. After 3 days of debate they approved one final mission. Sasha would cross into German territory to search for information about civilian casualties and prisoners. If he found any trace of his brother, he'd report it. If not, he'd return and accept reassignment away from combat zones. One last crossing. He went on December 23, 1942. The weather was bitter cold. Snow covered the ruins. The Volga had ice forming along both banks. Sasha wore extra layers, civilian clothes scavenged from abandoned buildings. He looked like any other refugee child, thin and desperate, searching through rubble for anything useful. He crossed the river in darkness, swam through ice chunks, reached the western bank in a sector he'd used before. The Germans had reduced their patrols in this area. They were focused further north, where Soviet attacks were more frequent. This southern sector was quiet. Sasha moved through the factory district systematically, checking buildings where he knew German command posts were located, places where prisoner records might be kept. He was searching for his brother's name on any list, any record of captured workers' battalion personnel. He spent 6 hours searching. Found partial records in 3 different locations. Cross-referenced names against what he remembered from his neighborhood. Viktor Filippov wasn't on any list. His brother was gone. Sasha was preparing to return to the river when he noticed unusual activity near a German headquarters building. Officers were destroying documents, burning papers in a courtyard. This wasn't normal procedure. The Germans weren't in the habit of destroying records unless they were preparing to evacuate. He watched from a collapsed building across the street. Counted the number of officers involved. Noted which documents they were burning and which they were packing into trucks. This level of activity suggested something significant was happening. He'd found something important, but he didn't understand what it meant. Not yet. What Sasha Filippov observed on December 23, 1942, was the beginning of the end for the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. The document burning, the packed trucks, the unusual level of officer activity, all indicated that German command was preparing for a significant change in operations. Sasha didn't know the strategic context. He couldn't have known that Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief effort had failed, that Operation Winter Storm had been stopped, that the 6th Army was now trapped without hope of rescue. But he recognized the signs of desperation when he saw them. He made it back across the Volga with his final intelligence report. The Soviet officers who debriefed him immediately recognized the significance of what he'd observed. Document burning meant the Germans were either preparing to evacuate or accepting that certain materials would fall into Soviet hands. Either way, it indicated a fundamental change in German strategic planning. Within 2 days, Soviet intelligence confirmed through other sources that the German 6th Army had given up hope of being relieved. The army was now focused on survival, on rationing supplies, on preparing for a Soviet assault they knew was coming. Sasha's observation had provided early warning of this shift. It allowed Soviet command to accelerate their offensive planning, to position forces for what would become Operation Ring, the final Soviet offensive that would destroy the 6th Army completely. The boy never learned how significant his final report was. By the time the Soviet offensive began on January 10, 1943, Sasha had been evacuated across the Volga to a refugee camp east of Stalingrad. The intelligence officers had kept their promise. His combat service was finished. He spent the remainder of the winter in the refugee camp, along with thousands of other displaced civilians. He never found any trace of his brother Viktor. In April 1943 he was transferred to an orphanage in the Ural Mountains, hundreds of miles from Stalingrad. The Soviet military never publicly acknowledged his service. Civilian scouts operated in secrecy. Their identities were protected. Their missions were classified. Sasha received no medals, no recognition, no formal record of his contributions to the battle. He simply disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of wartime refugee management, one more orphan child among millions. But his intelligence reports remained in Soviet military archives. 14 crossings into German territory. Over 50 separate intelligence observations. Information that had shaped Soviet operational planning during the most critical phase of the Stalingrad campaign. The German 6th Army surrendered on February 2, 1943. Over 90,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The battle for Stalingrad had cost both sides catastrophic casualties. The city itself was destroyed beyond recognition. But the Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. German forces never recovered their offensive capability. From February 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. The battle had been decided by many factors: Soviet numerical superiority, German logistical failures, brutal urban combat, strategic leadership. But among those factors, buried in classified intelligence reports, was the contribution of a 12-year-old boy who'd walked into German-controlled territory 14 times and walked back out with information that helped Soviet forces understand what they were facing. After the war, in the 1950s, Soviet military historians began declassifying some wartime intelligence operations. They published accounts of partisan groups, resistance networks, spy rings. Civilian scouts like Sasha were mentioned occasionally, but always without names, without specific details. Sasha Filippov lived the rest of his life in obscurity. He never returned to Stalingrad. The city was rebuilt after the war but renamed Volgograd in 1961. The streets where he'd grown up, the buildings where he'd hidden from German patrols, the basement where he'd sheltered after his parents died, all of it was gone, replaced by new construction, new neighborhoods, a new city built on the ruins of the old. He worked in factories, married, had children of his own. He never spoke about his war experiences. Never told his family about the crossings, the intelligence work, the missions into German territory. That part of his life remained locked away, a private history known only to himself and the intelligence officers who'd sent him across the Volga. He died in 1982 at the age of 52, from complications related to chronic respiratory problems that doctors traced back to the time he'd spent in freezing water during winter 1942. The cold had damaged his lungs permanently. The war had killed him slowly decades after the fighting stopped. His death certificate listed him as a factory worker. There was no mention of military service. No indication that he'd contributed to one of the most significant battles of World War II. But in the archives of Soviet military intelligence, his reports still existed. Faded documents describing German positions, troop movements, supply depots. Clinical observations written in the efficient language of intelligence analysis. They provided no sense of the fear involved, the cold, the hunger, the narrow escapes. They were just data. But that data had mattered. The legacy of Sasha Filippov's service isn't found in monuments or medals or official histories. It's found in the subtle ways his intelligence contributions shaped the tactical landscape of Stalingrad in late 1942. In the German ammunition dumps that were destroyed because he reported their locations. In the Soviet counterattacks that succeeded because commanders knew where German forces were concentrated. In the relief efforts that failed because Soviet forces had advance warning of German plans. His contribution was invisible but real. A child moving through ruins, observing, remembering, reporting. 14 times across the Volga and back. 14 times risking execution. 14 times choosing to go forward when every survival instinct screamed at him to stop. The Germans never caught him. Never identified him as a scout. Never added him to their lists of suspected spies. To them he was just another refugee child, one more piece of human wreckage in a destroyed city. Their inability to see him as a threat was the tactical blindness that cost them critical intelligence advantages. They were looking for soldiers, for trained scouts, for adult spies. They never imagined that a 12-year-old boy could be gathering the information that was being used against them. Their assumptions about who could be dangerous and who couldn't created the space in which Sasha operated. That space between assumption and reality was where the battle was actually fought. Years after the war, Soviet military analysts reviewing the Stalingrad campaign noted that civilian scouts had provided over 40% of actionable tactical intelligence during the critical October through December 1942 period. This intelligence stream had allowed Soviet command to operate with better battlefield awareness than German forces despite the Germans' superior reconnaissance equipment and trained intelligence personnel. The reason was simple. The Germans were looking up and out, watching for aircraft and patrols and radio signals. They weren't looking down at the refugees moving through their own positions, at the civilians they dismissed as militarily irrelevant. By the time German intelligence recognized the threat civilian scouts posed, it was too late. The battle's outcome was already decided. In 1995, 50 years after the end of World War II, Russian military historians published a comprehensive study of intelligence operations during the Stalingrad campaign. The study included a section on civilian scouts, with redacted names and operational details. One passage described a young scout, identified only as Scout F, who had completed 14 missions into German-held territory between September and December 1942. The study noted that Scout F's intelligence reports had directly contributed to successful Soviet operations and had provided early warning of German offensive preparations. The passage was 3 paragraphs long. It contained no personal details, no name, no photograph. Just a brief acknowledgement that someone young had done something significant during a battle that had killed over 2 million people. That was Sasha Filippov's only public recognition. He would have been 65 years old in 1995, if the war hadn't destroyed his lungs, if the cold water crossings hadn't damaged his health permanently. He would have been able to read about himself, about Scout F, about missions he'd almost forgotten. But he was already gone, buried in a cemetery in the Ural Mountains, far from the city where he'd once crossed a river 14 times to gather information that helped decide the largest battle of the largest war in human history. The Volga still flows through Volgograd. In winter, ice still forms along its banks. The current is still strong, still dangerous, still cold enough to kill in minutes. But no children swim across it anymore carrying intelligence gathered from enemy positions. That particular kind of courage, that particular kind of necessity, belongs to a specific time and place that no longer exists. Sasha Filippov walked into history as a child and out of history as a forgotten man. His story is one of thousands like it, of individuals whose contributions to great events went unrecorded, unrecognized, reduced to fragments in classified archives that few will ever read. But the intelligence reports remain. Clean, precise, clinical observations of German military positions in Stalingrad, autumn and winter 1942. Each report represents a crossing, a risk taken, a choice to go forward when going back would have been safer. 14 crossings. 14 times across the Volga and back. 14 times a child changed what commanders knew about a battle, and in changing what they knew, changed what they could do. That's the legacy. Not monuments or medals or public recognition. Just the quiet, persistent fact of intelligence gathered and reported, of information that mattered when it was needed most, of a child who did what soldiers couldn't do because the enemy couldn't imagine a child would be dangerous. The Germans learned that imagination has tactical consequences. By the time they understood what they'd missed, the boy was already across the river again, already reporting, already preparing for his next crossing. By the time they realized civilians could be soldiers without uniforms, the battle was already lost. The final irony of Sasha Filippov's war service is that his greatest contribution came from being underestimated. The Germans dismissed him because he was a child. That dismissal created the conditions for his success. He turned their assumptions about weakness and irrelevance into operational advantage. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth that military strategists sometimes forget. The most dangerous intelligence assets aren't always the most obvious ones. Sometimes they're 12 years old, swimming across a freezing river in the dark, carrying no weapons and no documents, just observations memorized and a determination to cross back with information that will matter. The Volga remembers even if history doesn't.